What happens when a nation's most celebrated warrior, a man hailed as a military genius and a living symbol of victory, decides that he knows better than the president? It's a question that goes to the very heart of a democracy, a question that tests the fragile line between a soldier's duty and a leader's ambition. In the spring of 1951, this wasn't a hypothetical exercise. It was a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time, threatening to tear the United States apart and plunge the world into a third world war. This is the story of two titans, a president and a general, whose personal feud became a public spectacle, and whose final confrontation would define the limits of power in the atomic age. This clash of wills held the world captive, a high-stakes drama that questioned the very structure of American command. If you find these pivotal moments in history as compelling as we do, ensure you subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. And if this story already has you hooked, give this video a like, share it with someone who appreciates a tale of leadership and consequence, and let us know in the comments something you didn't know about this critical period in history. It is the afternoon of April 11th, 1951, in Tokyo, a city remade in the image of its occupier. Inside the Grand American Embassy, a building that for more than 5 years has served as his home and command center, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur is hosting a quiet luncheon for the man they call the American Caesar, the hero of the Pacific and the benevolent, near-absolute ruler of occupied Japan. It is a routine affair. He is, by all accounts, in fine spirits, completely unaware that halfway across the globe, his 52-year career has just been publicly, brutally, and irrevocably detonated. He does not know that President Harry S. Truman, a man he privately scorns as a prima donna, has announced to the world that he, Douglas MacArthur, has been relieved of his command. The news doesn't arrive via coded cable or a formal military courier. Instead, it crackles to life not in the dead of night, but in the middle of the day through a commercial radio broadcast. One of the general's aides hears it first, a stunning news bulletin interrupting the music. He rushes to tell MacArthur's wife, Jean, who must then carry the unbelievable message to her husband. The most celebrated general of his generation, a 5-star icon whose name is synonymous with victory, learns of his own dismissal secondhand, like any ordinary citizen tuning into the news. It was an ignominious end to a legendary command, a political bombshell that sent shockwaves across a nation already fractured by an unpopular war. How did a conflict to save a small peninsula from communism escalate into a personal feud so profound that it threatened to redefine the American presidency? To understand the answer, we must go back to the beginning of the firestorm, to a clash of wills between two of the most powerful and unyielding men in American history. Our story truly begins not in the mud and snow of Korea, but in the long shadow of the Second World War. The world had been cleaved in two by an iron curtain, a phrase made famous by Winston Churchill. The United States, having emerged from the ashes as the world's preeminent economic and military power, now faced a new, insidious adversary: the creeping expansion of Soviet communism. The doctrine that would define American foreign policy for the next half-century was taking shape, a policy of containment. At the heart of this new world order stood two men, titans of their time, who could not have been more different. In the White House sat Harry S. Truman. He was the accidental president, the plain-spoken former haberdasher from Missouri thrust into the Oval Office by the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was bespectacled, often underestimated, and carried the immense weight of the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Yet, beneath his common man exterior was a core of Missouri steel. He was decisive, ferociously well-read, and possessed a fierce, almost stubborn belief in the institutions of American democracy. A sign on his desk famously read, "The buck stops here." For Truman, leadership was not about personal glory. It was about responsibility and making hard choices to prevent a nuclear apocalypse. Years before their final confrontation, Truman's private diaries revealed a deep wariness of MacArthur's monumental ego, noting the general's superiority complex and fearing he might seek the presidency. Thousands of miles away, In the opulent Daiichi Saimai building in Tokyo, Douglas MacArthur reigned as the supreme commander for the Allied powers. He was more than a general. He was a living legend, a figure of almost mythic proportions. From the trenches of World War I to his Medal of Honor-winning campaign in the Pacific, MacArthur's life was a tapestry of military genius and theatrical command. He had fulfilled his famous promise. "I shall return to the Philippines, accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, and then, as the effective ruler of Japan, had overseen a staggering transformation, turning a feudal, shattered nation into a burgeoning democracy." His signature corncob pipe, aviator sunglasses, and ornate, gold-scrambled hat were symbols of an authority that seemed almost regal. Surrounded by a devoted staff who revered him, MacArthur had come to see himself as the singular authority on Asia, a man whose instincts were superior to the dithering politicians in Washington. These two forces of nature, the pragmatist and the prodigy, were on a collision course. The spark that would ignite their conflict landed on June 25, 1950. On that day, the Communist North Korean People's Army, heavily armed by the Soviet Union, stormed across the 38th parallel. Seoul, the South Korean capital, fell in just 3 days. The poorly equipped South Korean and American forces were pushed back into a desperate, shrinking pocket of land around the port of Pusan. For Truman, this wasn't a distant skirmish. It was the first major test of his containment policy. To let South Korea fall would be a signal to Stalin that the free world was weak. He acted decisively, securing a United Nations resolution and committing American troops to a police action to repel the invasion. And to lead this UN command, there was only one choice: General Douglas MacArthur. In the grim summer of 1950, with UN forces clinging to life inside the Pusan perimeter, MacArthur conceived a plan so audacious, so strategically brilliant, that it was met with universal skepticism by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He proposed an amphibious landing hundreds of miles behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. It was a strategic masterstroke, but a tactical nightmare. Incheon had some of the most extreme tides in the world, with variations of over 30 feet, creating vast mudflats at low tide. The approaches were through narrow, easily mined channels, and the city was protected by towering seawalls that would have to be scaled under fire. The Joint Chiefs were horrified, viewing the operation as catastrophically risky. But MacArthur, in his singular, commanding way, was resolute. He flew to Tokyo to personally persuade them, painting a vision of a single, decisive blow. He famously argued, "The very arguments you have made as to the impracticabilities involved will tend to ensure for me the element of surprise." His force of personality was overwhelming. Reluctantly, Washington gave him the green light. On September 15, 1950, U.S. Marines stormed the seawalls of Incheon. The surprise was total. Within days, they recaptured Seoul, cutting the North Korean Army supply lines. The enemy force, caught between the hammer of Incheon and the anvil of the forces breaking out from Pusan, disintegrated. It was a stunning, almost miraculous vindication of MacArthur's genius. With the North Koreans in full retreat, the initial goal of restoring the 38th parallel now seemed too modest. Spurred by the dramatic success, Washington approved a new objective: the complete liberation and unification of Korea. UN forces surged deep into North Korea, racing towards the Yalu River, the border with a newly communist China. Victory seemed so close that MacArthur made a bold and ultimately catastrophic prediction: the boys would be home by Christmas. As MacArthur's forces neared the Chinese border, President Truman grew anxious. To get a handle on his larger-than-life general, Truman decided he had to meet MacArthur face-to-face. Since MacArthur refused to leave his theater of command, Truman flew nearly 7,000 miles to Wake Island. The optics were telling. MacArthur greeted the President of the United States not with a salute, but with a casual air, his shirt unbuttoned, his famous hat worn at a Johnny angle. During their meeting, Truman pressed him on the most critical question: would China intervene? MacArthur was dismissive. He assured the president the war was all but won, stating the chance of major Chinese intervention was very little. Truman, wanting to believe his victorious general, left the island reassured. MacArthur was catastrophically wrong. In late October 1950, even as they spoke, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers were secretly streaming across the frozen Yalu River. On November 25th, they struck in a human tidal wave. The most harrowing battle took place at the Chosin Reservoir, where U.S. Marines, surrounded and fighting in temperatures of 30 below zero, executed a brutal 78-mile fighting retreat to the sea. The home by Christmas promise had turned into a frozen nightmare. UN forces were sent reeling back south, past the 38th parallel once more. Seoul fell for a second time. A new, far more dangerous war had begun, and the fragile trust between the president and his general was about to shatter completely. Halfway through this saga of ambition and authority, it's clear how easily battlefield victories can clash with global strategy. These are the leadership dilemmas that define nations. If you want to continue exploring these crucial historical conflicts, subscribe now and enable notifications so you never miss a story. Show your support by liking this video, share it with someone who needs to understand the complexities of command, and comment below on what aspect of this escalating feud you find most compelling so far. The disastrous retreat from the Yalu River laid bare the fundamental chasm between Truman and MacArthur. It was no longer just a disagreement. It was a battle over the very definition of victory in the atomic age. President Truman saw Korea through the terrifying lens of the Cold War. His primary goal was not total victory in Korea, but preventing World War III. He and his advisors in Washington and at the United Nations advocated for a limited war, a war fought for limited objectives, primarily the preservation of South Korea. They desperately sought a negotiated peace that wouldn't risk a global conflagration with China and, by extension, its ally, the Soviet Union. But for MacArthur, limited war wasn't just a bad strategy. It was a betrayal of the soldier's creed. His entire career was built on the foundation of total victory. In a public statement that became his mantra, he insisted, "There is no substitute for victory." He saw the real enemy not as North Korea, but as Red China, and believed this was the time and place to confront the menace of communism head-on. He began to lobby, both privately and publicly, for a dramatic escalation, a naval blockade of China, bombing factories and infrastructure in Manchuria, and even using nationalist Chinese forces from Formosa to open a second front. To Truman and the Joint Chiefs, MacArthur's proposals were beyond reckless. They were a recipe for a full-scale war with China that could draw on the Soviets and escalate into a nuclear holocaust. On December 6, 1950, President Truman issued a clear directive to all overseas commanders. All public statements on policy were to be cleared beforehand by the State and Defense Departments. It was a gag order aimed squarely at one man, Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur ignored it. Throughout early 1951, his defiance grew more brazen and more public. He gave interviews to magazines and wrote letters that were thinly veiled attacks on the administration's policy. In March, just as Truman was preparing a delicate diplomatic push for a ceasefire, MacArthur torpedoed it. Without authorization, he issued his own ultimatum to China, a belligerent statement taunting the enemy commander and sabotaging any chance for peace talks. The White House was apoplectic. This was not just disagreement. It was gross insubordination. The final, unforgivable straw came on March 20th, 1951, when MacArthur wrote a private letter to Joseph W. Martin Jr., the Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives. In it, he openly criticized the administration's Europe First strategy, writing, "Here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest." He concluded with a line that sealed his fate. "There is no substitute for victory." On April 5th, Congressman Martin read the letter aloud on the floor of the House. It was a public, direct challenge to the president's authority as commander-in-chief. For Harry Truman, this was the ultimate act of defiance. A president could not command the armed forces if his generals could openly defy policy and appeal to the political opposition. He summoned his top advisors, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. After careful deliberation, they unanimously concurred. MacArthur had to be removed, not for his military failures, but on the fundamental military principle that a general cannot be allowed to subvert the constitutional authority of elected civilian government. The decision was made. Truman would fire a living legend. The decision to fire MacArthur was one of Washington's most explosive secrets. Truman, fearing the savvy general might resign first and paint himself as a martyr, decided to act fast. The plan was to transmit the orders through secure military channels directly to MacArthur, with a public announcement to follow. But the execution was a catastrophic mess. On the evening of April 10th in Washington, a series of communication snafus delayed the secure message. Meanwhile, word of the momentous decision leaked to a journalist. The White House, facing an imminent press scoop, was forced to rush its timeline. At 1 a.m. on April 11th, reporters were hastily summoned to the press room and handed mimeograph sheets containing Truman's stunning order. Minutes later, the news flashed across the globe. Truman fires MacArthur. Back in Tokyo, General MacArthur was hosting his luncheon, blissfully unaware. It was his wife, Jean, who learned the news first from a frantic aide who had heard a radio bulletin. She faced the unenviable task of informing her husband that his celebrated 52-year career was over. Accounts from his inner circle describe a man of incredible, almost surreal composure. He walked out of the luncheon and listened to his wife's report. There was no outburst, no visible shock. He turned to Jean and, with quiet finality, spoke the first words of his new life. "Jeannie, we're going home." Only later did the official notification finally arrive, stripping him of his titles in a single, curt message. Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief, Far East. He was to turn over his command to Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway, effective immediately. The American Caesar had been deposed. The news hit the American public with the force of a physical blow. If Truman expected the public to understand his sober constitutional reasoning, he had profoundly misjudged the nation's mood. The immediate reaction was pure, unadulterated fury. For millions of Americans, MacArthur was the personification of American strength and victory. Truman, in their eyes, had appeased communism. The White House was inundated with angry telegrams, outnumbering supportive messages by 20-1. Truman was burned in effigy on town squares. Influential senators called for Truman's impeachment. A Gallup poll showed that 66% of the public disapproved of the president's action. Truman's own approval rating cratered to a dismal 22%, a historic low for any president, even lower than Richard Nixon's during the depths of Watergate. In stark contrast, MacArthur's return to the United States was not that of a disgraced commander, but of a conquering hero. He hadn't set foot on American soil in 14 years, and the country welcomed him with a near-hysterical outpouring of adoration. When his plane landed in San Francisco, 500,000 people turned out. The scene was even more spectacular in New York City, where an estimated 7.5 million people thronged the streets for a ticker-tape parade, the largest in the city's history. He was hailed as a martyr, a brilliant soldier sacrificed by cowardly politicians. The nation was dangerously divided, and MacArthur, a master of theater, was about to step onto his grandest stage yet. On April 19, 1951, just 8 days after his dismissal, Douglas MacArthur addressed a joint session of Congress. The galleries were packed. The tension was electric. Across the country, an estimated 30 million Americans were glued to their radios. MacArthur, dressed in his immaculate uniform but without a single one of his many medals, strode to the rostrum. "I address you," he began, with neither rancor nor bitterness in the fading twilight of life, with but one purpose in mind, to serve my country. For 37 minutes, he held the nation spellbound. He laid out his strategic vision with brilliant clarity, defending his proposals as the only path to victory and condemning the administration's policy of limited war. He painted a heartbreaking picture of Korea, a nation being sacrificed on the altar of political indecision. The tragedy of Korea, he said, is further heightened by the fact that its military action is confined to its territorial limits, while the enemy's sanctuaries are fully protected from such attack. He was masterfully making his case against the president, portraying himself as a clear-eyed warrior shackled by timid politicians. Then, he brought his address to its unforgettable, emotional conclusion. His voice, thick with emotion, hushed the chamber. "I am closing my 52 years of military service," he said. "When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all of my boyish hopes and dreams. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barracks ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away." He paused, letting the words hang in the electrified air. "And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye." The chamber exploded. Lawmakers, many with tears in their eyes, leaped to their feet in a thunderous ovation. It was a masterstroke of rhetoric that cemented his image as a noble warrior wronged. For a moment, it seemed as though MacArthur, the private citizen, was more powerful than the president himself. In the wake of MacArthur's seismic speech, the pressure on Truman was immense. The Senate launched a joint investigation into the firing and the administration's war policy. The MacArthur hearings began on May 3, 1951. For 3 days, MacArthur was the star witness, dazzling senators with his intellect and unshakable self-assurance. But then, the Truman administration mounted its counteroffensive. One by one, the president's top civilian and military officials, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and the 4 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came to testify. Methodically and unanimously, they dismantled MacArthur's case. They testified that MacArthur hadn't just disagreed with policy, but had publicly defied it to a degree that jeopardized the foundational principle of civilian control over the military. The most devastating blow came from General Omar Bradley, the respected chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Bradley, a soldier's soldier known for his quiet competence, delivered the testimony that turned the tide of public opinion. He explained that the Joint Chiefs had categorically rejected MacArthur's proposals to widen the war. Then he delivered the most famous and damning sentence of the entire controversy. "Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy." The line was a thunderclap. It was the military establishment itself, speaking with one voice, siding with the president against their most famous commander. It laid bare the truth that MacArthur was advocating a strategy the nation's top military minds considered dangerously reckless. Slowly, the testimony cooled the public's fervor. The calls for Truman's impeachment faded. MacArthur's presidential ambitions for 1952 fizzled, and the nomination went to another general, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Just as he had predicted, Douglas MacArthur began to fade away. Harry Truman, though his popularity never fully recovered during his presidency, had won the constitutional war that mattered most. He had upheld the principle of civilian authority over the military. The showdown between Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur was far more than a clash of 2 powerful men. It was a defining moment for America. It was a struggle between the old way of war, total victory at any cost, and the new, terrifying reality of the nuclear age, where restraint could be the highest form of courage. MacArthur's famous declaration that old soldiers never die, they just fade away, became his epitaph. He was a brilliant, brave, and deeply flawed soldier whose towering ego ultimately led him to challenge the very system he had sworn for 52 years to defend. Truman, the unassuming man from Missouri, emerged as a resolute defender of the Constitution. His firing of MacArthur was an act of immense political courage that cost him dearly in the short term, but preserved a bedrock principle of American democracy: that the military serves the people, and that final authority rests not with the generals in their uniforms, but with the elected civilian leadership. The story of Truman and MacArthur remains a timeless lesson in the burdens of power and the solemnity of duty. If you found this deep dive into one of America's greatest constitutional crises valuable, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Help us bring more history to light by liking this video and share it with a friend who appreciates the complex dramas that have shaped our world. Finally, let us know in the comments, which figure in this story, the unwavering President Truman or the brilliant General MacArthur, do you find more compelling and why? Thank you for watching.